of Manchester, and today I'm going to be talking through some of the work that I did through my PhD on the high throughput simulations and machine learning for polymer. What's okay for polymer uh, predicting polymer phase behavior, and then at the end of the presentation as well, I'm going to try and touch on some of the kind of expansion of the work that I'm doing after my PhD as well. So my PhD focused on plasticizers, which are these small additive molecules which are added to polymer melts to improve their processability. So the plasticizer molecule will sit in between the polymer chains, allowing them to slide over one another more easily. And this makes the material much softer and much more easier to process. So my project was sponsored by Continental. So tires is kind of the main focus, and typically the plasticizers that are used for tires are crude oil based. Their compatibility with the polymer matrix is a key component to their success. So we want the molecule to have good contact with the matrix. If it forms into a large aggregate, then it's not going to have much of an effect on the properties of the polymer. So the popular plasticizers are quite volatile and carcinogenic, and actually they can leach from the tire and end up in local water supplies. So in recent years, there's been a really strong motivation to replace the conventional plasticizers with bio-derived ones instead. So there's been work, for example, on coconut oil and also lots of different vegetable oils. However, in general, trying to find new additive molecules, whether it's plasticizers or filler materials like carbon black or silica, that would work well in the tire for its mechanical and rheological properties. It's kind of a trial and error exercise. So the setup of my PhD was how can we reduce the trial and error in terms of the compatibility of the plasticizer as much as possible for the experimentalists. So our idea was to have a funnel-like procedure where we first study very coarse representations of the plasticizer molecules. And then we, from that, create a generic set of design rules, and we can use them to screen out plasticizers that are not likely to be compatible with the polymer matrix. And then we can move on to do higher and higher complexity in terms of the atomistic detail in further simulations with reduced sets of plasticizers. And then hopefully at the end, we'll end up with molecules that would be of industrial relevance for Continental. So to do this, we use the Kremmer-Grest model to model our polymer. This is a really popular generic coarse grain model for polymer melts. However, fairly recently, it was modified to induce chemical specificity for a range of commodity melts. And this included cis polyisoprene, which is the main component of tires. So that's the polymer that we mainly focused on through the work. The main feature of the model is that the non-bonded interaction potential is WCA, which is like the Lennard-Jones, except only the repulsive part of the potential, because it really speeds things up in terms of the simulation. And then the flexibility is induced along the chain with an added bending potential. So the first part of this work, so basically come up with a set of generic plasticizers, which we can then simulate within the polyisoprene melt. For the plasticizers, we chose to use the same Kremmer-Grest model as the polyisoprene, except we played a bit with the geometry of the molecules and also the flexibility. So you can see that we have kind of this backbone of the plasticizer that we've defined, and we can add side chains to that. In this particular work, they were just evenly spaced along the backbone relatively. But we could change their grafting density, so how many side chains are along the backbone, and we could also change the side chain length as well. And then we also had a look at changing the flexibility, so we can either use our original bending potential, we have a very flexible molecule, or we can change the potential to a harmonic one, and we'd have something more rod-like and rigid. So initially we chose a pretty small set of the plasticizers. We only had 48 of them because at this time the simulations, although they were coarse grained, phase behavior does kind of develop over quite long time scales. So the simulations were still quite expensive. And essentially, we wanted to establish a structured property relationship between properties of the plasticizer and then their phase behavior, which we would then go on to do some high throughput simulations and machine learning with. So in order to do this, we needed to find a way to quantitatively define the plasticizer aggregation. And this became really useful for us later when we did more high throughput for these simulations. So we came up with this miscibility descriptor. It's based on the radial distribution function of the plasticizers. You just imagine that this is our simulation box, it's filled with plasticizers. We basically just look at the density of the plasticizers within the sphere that I've labeled and then compare it with the density outside the sphere. And then if we get a number close to 1, that means everything's relatively evenly dispersed. And if it's much larger than 1, then there's a lot of aggregation. So this is a nice automated way that we found to define the miscibility, which didn't require our intervention. So in terms of the miscibility results, we found that all of the flexible plasticizers that we tested, regardless of the size or the geometry, were miscible. This is something that we expected from a previous work. The rod-like plasticizers had more interesting behavior. Actually, if we simulated the rod-like plasticizers and we had them very high molecular weight without the side chains, we saw aggregation. However, if we add small side chains, we actually saw crossover to miscible behavior, so they disrupted our aggregation. But then if we made them even bigger, we see a crossover again to immiscible behavior. So it's pretty clear that the size of the plasticizer for this set corresponded or correlated to the miscibility behavior in the melt. And then we use this to study a variety of descriptors within the work that we hoped we could go on to use machine learning with. This is just 2 of them. We use the square radius of gyration of the plasticizer and also the acylindricity, which is a measure of cylindrical asymmetry of the molecule. And you can see that there's a pretty good correlation between the descriptor and the miscibility, where our miscibility parameter is the x-axis. And the main thing about this is that these are very cheap simulations to do compared to the 3 or 4 days that it was taking us to do the larger simulation. But we wanted a much expanded set of the plasticizers. We only looked at a small region of the potential search space here. We wanted to vary more properties. And that brings us on to the kind of latest development of the work that is still ongoing. And here we looked at the full combinatorial space of all of the different possible plasticizers that we could have for a range of backbone lengths. So now the side chains can be placed anywhere on the backbone. They can have any length. We also consider a difference in flexibility between the backbone and the side chain, and different different intermediate degrees of plasticizer flexibility were considered as well. So we ended up with this really large combinatorial space of all of the plasticizers we were interested in. However, the data acquisition cost for the miscibility was still quite high. So we thought that this was a good kind of data to use for like quite a standard pool-based active learning procedure. So here we use a relatively small amount of data for an initial training set that we already had of about 50 plasticizer molecules. We train a random forest classification model on it, and then we query from our large combinatorial space in the unlabeled pool. We chose a hybrid query strategy to do this. We use a combination of query by committee. This measures the disagreement between the individual decision trees in the random forest, and the ones that they disagree most on are the ones that are queried. And we combine that with some random query sampling as well, because we wanted to make sure that we had a chance to sample from unexplored regions of the search space that might not be covered by the query by committee. So then we go on to label the molecules by performing our expensive molecular dynamics simulation, add that to the label pool, and then we retrain our classification model, and we also retune the hyperparameters using a grid search with cross-validation. For our descriptors here, we slightly changed the descriptors. We wanted to, for this initial round of the active learning, we wanted to see if we didn't actually have to do any simulations at all, and we could just input features straight from the plasticizer. So, for example, the backbone length or the average sidechain length. And then when we did that, we got the following results. The first graph is just the F1 score of the classifier with the active learning round. So we found that we had a plateau, an F1 score of about 0.89 after 8 rounds of the active learning. And then in simulation time, that took about a week and a half after we'd optimized the procedure. And then when we made predictions on the combinatorial search space, which I have here decomposed by the principal, by the 3 of the principal components, we saw 2 main regions of immiscibility predicted and then a lot of miscible regions as well. So when we had a look at what those regions actually corresponded to, we found that as per the previous work, it was still predicting that small or more flexible molecules are miscible, but we also predicted some new regions of the space, and that was that if our side chains were very rigid compared to the backbone, then we saw they were more likely to be immiscible if the side chains were very long. However, if the backbone was very rigid and our side chains remained flexible, then we saw miscible behavior even if the side chains were very long. So from that, we have generated kind of a generic set of the design rules that we're interested in. And we've also started to do some validation of the design rules to simulations with atomistic detail instead. So we envision that our coarse-grained molecules represent sort of generic hydrocarbons. So we tested a range of alkanes of different lengths within the polyisoprene and also polyenes, which have the many double bonds along the chain, so more rigid. So that's kind of how we implemented some of the design rules. We found so far that the results from here support the regions of the design space. So that's positive. This work is still very much ongoing though, and also for the active learning, we have plans to expand the search space into different polymers as well, perhaps using transfer learning or similar. But then I just wanted to quickly at the end talk about more of the big picture of our work that might be more of community interest. So at the moment, our simulation workflow handles the automated generation of the input files, also the equilibration and on-the-fly analysis for our specific application, which is the coarse-grained polymer plasticizer systems, which we've then gone on to use for machine learning. But our latest project is actually generalizing this procedure to atomistic polymer melts from smiles through parameter assignment to the automatic equilibration and the on-the-fly analysis. And this isn't a super trivial thing to do for polymers because they take such a long time to equilibrate and they're quite complicated systems. But we've made good progress. Being able to simulate about 100 polymers atomistically in high throughput so far. And then just briefly, I wanted to mention that specifically within this workflow, we're working with the developer of a software called DL Field. And this is for force field parameter assignment. It's a very versatile software, offers a range of different force fields and also flexibility for user-defined force fields. Yeah, so I thought that it might be of interest for anyone who's also doing this kind of work. So I just want to thank my supervisors and also the other people that have contributed to the work, and then the University of Manchester and the computational facilities that they provided. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your talk, and I invite you to ask questions. So if there are no questions from the audience, then maybe I would like to ask. You showed us your workflow, but could you tell me what is the future outlook of your work, and are your findings tested experimentally, or are there plans to do?
So I can say that in terms of the plasticizer polymer portion of the work, there are currently some experiments being done within Continental on some resins that kind of follow the design rules that we identified within the work. But I can't share kind of any more detail than that at the moment.
So all the designs that you explore, can they be made in the lab, or do you have some constraints also that you would have to put in the descriptor of what can eventually be synthesized?
So at the moment, because of the model that we actually chose for the work, the with the WCA potential, really our descriptors would only apply to systems where the plasticizers or the polymers aren't very polar. So we kind of have that limitation. In terms of mapping the coarse grain back to atomistic, there's not a direct mapping that we can do. It's very much just these generic design rules in terms of, should we be looking for the molecule to have, rigid side chains or rigid backbone, that kind of thing would be implemented.
Okay. Are there any more questions? If not, then let's thank our speaker again